The issue of legislative term limits was a grassroots electoral reform that swept the country in the 1990s.
That we have almost a professional legislature. And I think everybody recognizes that the fundamental premise in our democracy is that we have citizen government, that we have people from citizenry come into the legislature, serve, and go home. And we had one legislator that had been a senator for over 40 years. I ended up serving 17 years and finally reached a point where I simply was burned out and resigned midterm.
In Ohio, term limits first surfaced during the 119th General Assembly, when then State Representative Ronald Model and then State Representative Larry Manahan introduced competing plans.
The original legislation covered federal as well as state lawmakers. And then it was noted that constitutionally there was no way you could limit the federal, because every other state, unless it was done at every state in the union, but that wasn't to be. So that was dropped out, and then we were left with just the state of Ohio.
In November 1992, Ohio joined 14 other states by approving ballot question number 3 by a whopping 64.8%. The ballot read, "Constitutional Amendment. Limit successive terms of office for state senators from Ohio to 2 terms and state representatives to 4 terms."
Passed, and I became a professional legislator. And I joined with the goal of disrupting that process and ensuring that we had citizen representation, and voted for term limits.
The issue of career politicians was one of the most significant issues behind the passage of term limits here in Ohio. Reform advocates hoped that a citizen legislature would be more in touch with their constituents' needs than the career politicians, since they would be living and working in the same communities daily as their fellow constituents, whereas career legislators seemed detached from the real needs of their district. They hoped that term-limited legislators would be more aware of their constituents' attitudes and preferences and more accessible than the career politician.
The term limit has a purpose that's fundamentally good, except we forgot and lost institutional memory. And I can't tell you how often in a caucus the senator with 40 years would interject, "Hey, wait a minute, you know, back in 1972 this same issue came up, and here are some things that we ought to consider." Well, that institutional memory was helpful in processing legislation.
Institutional knowledge is vital to passing quality legislation because each General Assembly only lasts for 2 years. That means that a legislator that has only 2 years to develop a bill, get it passed through the House of Representatives committee, passed on the House floor, passed through the Senate committee, passed on the Senate floor, and then signed by the governor into law. Prior to term limits, legislators had time for their bill to be revised and reintroduced. Term limits force legislators with a fixed departure date to push their policy priorities through more quickly, producing poorer quality legislation.
And it takes really 3 or 4 years just to get your feet on the ground. Well, now with term limits, a legislator has to make a name for himself or develop a level in the pecking order immediately, because he's only going to be there 8 years. And as a consequence, you don't really have that learning cycle behind your belt and I don't think can operate effectively. I've been disappointed with term limits. In retrospect, I think the real problem was not term limits, it was leadership limits.
Term-limited legislators have been debilitated by a loss of expertise. Term limits force a large amount of time to be spent at the legislature to be focused on bringing the legislator up to speed on redundant issues as opposed to building on institutional knowledge. They are now less familiar or skilled in the legislative process, thus damaging the policy making and policy oversight capabilities of the legislature relative to other institutional actors. This informational asymmetry results in a shift of power to staffers, bureaucrats, and the executive branch.
I became chairman of education, and I'm a strong proponent of choice, supported vouchers, various factors in the operation of the school that gave us movement of students. They could go to the school they wanted, that sort of thing. Post-secondary option. But then I realized all of a sudden, as chairman, I am controlling a lot of things that maybe need a different perspective. So it came to me that maybe the real problem is there should be a turnover in the leadership positions so that you don't have a Speaker of the House for 15 years. Speaker of the House can serve for maybe 4 years, and some other legislator take that position. President of the Senate should be a turnover. And keep the institutional memory, but evolve or revolve the leadership post. And I think that would have been a more effective way, but that...
A survey taken showed that in 1992, 49% of legislators supported term limits, while 51% opposed them. In 2000, however, only 28% of those same legislators supported term limits, where 72% now oppose them. 68% of those legislators felt that term limits weaken public policy, and 62% did not believe that term limits would eliminate career politicians.
I don't think there's any question, but what the cause and effect of this legislation has been detrimental, and we don't have the smooth operation of government that we did have.
I do think that with the turnover, it makes less knowledge of people of their legislator. When you were, if people wanted you to stay in, you know, again, it was their vote, they got a chance to really know you. If they didn't like you or didn't think you were doing a good job, they could put you out. Now you ask someone who their state legislator is, and they kind of fumble around unless they're really knowledgeable. But I would say the average person could not tell you who their state house person is or their state senator. You know, 8 years is not a very long time.
You might even ask your classmates, who's your state senator? Mm-hmm. Who's your representative?
How long have they been there?
And I'll bet you half of them
don't know.
Will stutter around and maybe finally come up with a name, but it won't be on the tip of their tongue.
Good thought.
Currently, an amendment to lengthen term limits are being discussed and may soon be seen on the Ohio ballot.